heavy rain and powerful winds batter the island nation of Singapore. Dozens of aircraft circle overhead, anxiously waiting for a gap in the storm. Amidst the chaos is Singapore Airlines Flight 319, a Boeing 777 carrying 280 people. It has come all the way from London, and now, as it waits, it's beginning to run dangerously low on fuel. Minute by minute, as the bad weather spreads, the pilots begin to run out of options. Will they make it into an airport? Or will their fuel run out before they do? What you're about to see is a stark example of how quickly things can go from routine to critical in an airliner. This is the story of Singapore Airlines Flight 319. On the evening of October 24, 2022, 280 passengers and crew board a Singapore Airlines Boeing 777 at London's Heathrow Airport. They're bound for Singapore, a 13-hour journey across half the world. On board is a mixture of passengers. Some are Singaporeans heading home after a holiday. Others are business travelers moving between two major financial capitals. And some are European tourists using Singapore as a gateway to explore Southeast Asia. Up front in command is a 55-year-old captain. He has a huge amount of flying experience, more than 14,000 hours, just over 10,000 of which are on the 777. He'll be acting as pilot monitoring for this flight, while the first officer flies the plane. That first officer is 31 years old and has logged over 2,000 hours of flying time, almost all on the Boeing 777. Because this is a long-haul flight, there is also a relief first officer on board, who will rest during parts of the cruise and rotate into the cockpit as needed. As part of their pre-flight duties, the three pilots review the forecasted weather en route and at Singapore. The terminal area forecast tells them to expect periods of light to moderate thunderstorms and rain on arrival. This is pretty typical weather for Singapore. Surrounded by warm seas, thunderstorms build year-round. The captain decides that 106,000 kilograms of fuel is more than adequate. It covers the fuel to destination, fuel to an alternate, contingency fuel for delays, and the legally required final reserve. No one yet realizes just how tight that margin will become. Just before 8 p.m., the aircraft pushes back from the gate. The pilots start the plane's two enormous engines and begin taxiing out to runway 27 right. The first officer lines up on the runway and advances the throttles to take off power. Within moments, Flight 319 is airborne and climbing out over London. Half an hour later, as it passes over Belgium, the 777 reaches its initial cruising altitude. The cabin crew begins their in-flight service. Passengers eat and watch movies as the plane cruises high over Europe. Things are routine in the cockpit. As the pilots expected, air traffic control gives them several shortcuts over Europe due to reduced night traffic. All proceeds as normal as the plane cruises on autopilot towards the rising sun. Nearly 12 hours pass. The 777 is now about to begin its descent into Singapore. After a long night in cramped seats, breakfast is being served. The two operating pilots are back at the controls, planning their arrival. According to their flight management computer, they'll be landing with 7,000 kilograms of fuel on board, well above the roughly 3,000 kilograms required by law as final reserve. But for other flights currently making their way into Singapore, things are not so rosy. The winds have suddenly shifted. Aircraft landing are encountering tailwinds exceeding their limits. For Flight 319, the weather is about to become their worst enemy. At 5 minutes past 4 p.m. local time, the pilots are instructed to enter a holding pattern at a waypoint called Paspao, 40 miles north of Singapore. The captain begins using his weather radar to map out the storms. What he sees is not welcome. Heavy rain over Singapore, and more worryingly, intense rain over their planned alternate airports as well. This is not good. Pilots need options. Right now, it looks like this crew doesn't have many. However, further south on the Indonesian island of Batam, conditions look better. The pilots note Batam as a potential alternate if they can't make it into Singapore. As all of this is happening, the winds at Singapore shift dramatically. They now favor the opposite runway. For Flight 319 approaching from the north, this means they'll have to proceed the long way around the airport. The pilots reprogram the approach into their system. The flight is cleared out of the holding pattern. But now, just as they're getting ready, bad news arrives. The winds have switched around again. Aircraft trying to land are encountering tailwinds beyond safe limits. It seems like no matter what runway the airport uses, the winds swing around to come from the opposite direction. By the time Flight 319 is ready to make its approach, 2 aircraft have already gone around because of the shifting winds and torrential rainfall. Before they get the chance to attempt an approach, the controller's voice crackles through the radio. All flights coming to Singapore are now suspended while controllers reassess the weather. The controller tells Flight 319 to head to a waypoint called Samco and enter a holding pattern there. Expected holding time, 5 minutes. But as they circle at low altitude, they're burning fuel fast. The captain tells the controller they can do just 1 round of the hold before needing to divert. The clock is ticking, and their options are shrinking. Flight 319 enters the hold at Samco. Conveniently, Samco is about the same distance from Singapore as it is from Batam. In a sense, it would be just as easy to go to one as to the other. They just need word from the controller about which airport will take them. But more bad news crackles through the radio. The visibility in Singapore has dropped below 500 meters. The weather shows no sign of improving. The controller tells Indonesian ATC that Flight 319 may need to divert to Batam. The crew still prefer Singapore. It's their destination after all. And there's always a chance the weather will improve just enough for a single approach. But every minute they spend in the holding pattern reduces the number of approaches they can safely attempt anywhere. And in weather like this, it's not inconceivable they'll need more than one. As the plane approaches Samco again to commence its second hold, the captain tells ATC that after this, they'll need to divert. The controller directs the flight to head south. This is not what the pilots want. To fly south would be to fly away from both Singapore and Batam. The captain asks why they're being directed away from both possible landing airports. The controller tells him Singapore is still not accepting arrivals, and Batam has not yet approved their diversion. Flight 319 is stuck in limbo. Not wanting to head away from a suitable airport, the captain asks if he can perform an orbit over Samco instead, staying close to both options. The controller approves this. But before they even begin the orbit, their fuel reaches the point where if they don't divert now, they'll begin eating into the fuel they must legally land with, their final reserve. That final reserve is meant to be untouchable. It's there to give the crew about 30 minutes of holding at low altitude in an absolute worst-case scenario. Flight 319 is now right on the edge of that buffer. The captain tells the controller they need to divert to Batam. Now, with the captain now as pilot flying, Flight 319 heads toward Batam. The controller instructs them to fly south to come around for an approach to runway 22. Even at this late stage, the pilots are still trying to see if they can land at Singapore if something suddenly improves. But realistically, Singapore is no longer a viable option. As the fuel level falls ever lower, the pressure mounts. The first officer tells air traffic control they're now at minimum fuel. This is not yet a full emergency call, but it is a clear warning. The flight is committed to landing at Batam, and it cannot accept any more delays without dipping into final reserve. Still, the controller tells them Batam has not yet formally approved their arrival. The flight continues on course. Just a few minutes later, when the aircraft is 13 nautical miles from Batam, its computers predict it will reach the airport with only the final reserve fuel left in its tanks. The pilots now have no choice. The captain declares Mayday fuel to air traffic control. This is a full emergency. It means the aircraft will land with less than final reserve and needs immediate priority. In this status, the crew are authorized to deviate from normal ATC instructions if needed to keep the flight safe. Approval or no approval, Flight 319 is now committed to landing at Batam. The captain begins the approach to runway 22. The weather is bad, but still within limits at first. As they descend through 1,600 feet, the tower delivers devastating news. The winds have shifted again. They're now gusting to 30 knots from behind the aircraft, well outside landing limits for a safe touchdown. The captain has no choice but to abandon the approach. He pushes the throttles forward and climbs back up. Now it's clear. The aircraft will land with less than final reserve in its tanks. Every second they spend in the air is eating into fuel that was never meant to be used. They reposition for a second attempt, this time to runway 04, the opposite direction. To reduce workload in the poor weather, the crew decide to use an automatic landing. But there's a problem they haven't fully appreciated. Runway 04 at bottom isn't certified for autoland. The localizer beam that guides the aircraft laterally to the runway is misaligned by about 1 degree from the runway heading. That might sound tiny, but it's enough to disqualify the runway from automatic landings. The airline's briefing material for Batam doesn't spell this out clearly. The crew, pressed for time and fuel, don't pick up the misalignment from the published charts. On the second approach, as the autopilot follows the localizer down towards the runway, the aircraft doesn't line up quite where the captain expects. Near the decision altitude, with the runway environment not matching what he sees on his instruments, the captain makes another difficult call. He disconnects the autoland and goes around again. 2 approaches attempted, 2 go-arounds, and the fuel is still burning. The pressure is immense. This really is their last chance. They set up for a third approach, again to runway 04. This time, the captain plans to fly it manually, using the instruments as guidance, but not relying on the autoland. The winds are still strong, but now more favorable for landing on this end of the runway. At 5:19 p.m., after nearly an hour-long ordeal of holding, diversions, and repeated approaches, Flight 319 finally touches down at Batam. The sense of relief in the cockpit is overwhelming. The 280 people on board are safe. With barely enough fuel left to keep the engines running, the captain taxis back to the gate at Batam. In the aftermath, investigators piece together what went wrong. The crew had planned their fuel based on typical weather conditions, but they encountered an extraordinary situation. Severe thunderstorms blanketed not only Singapore, but all nearby alternates simultaneously. The investigation revealed several critical factors. The captain's decision not to take additional discretionary fuel in London left little margin for unexpected, extended delays. Once the weather deteriorated beyond the forecast, that tight margin quickly evaporated. The crew's reluctance to divert earlier, hoping Singapore would reopen at any moment, cost them precious time and fuel they simply didn't have. At Batam, the pilots attempted an automatic landing on runway 04, without realizing the runway wasn't certified for autoland. The final approach course was misaligned with the runway heading by 1 degree. Normally, a minor technical detail, this became crucial in low visibility when the crew tried to rely on the automation. This detail, overlooked during approach preparation, contributed to their second failed landing attempt. Investigators also found that the pilots had become overly reliant on the airline's briefing documents, which didn't systematically cover smaller airports like Batam. Important information, such as auto-land suitability and localizer alignment, had to be derived from the published charts, not from the airline's summaries. Given how close this flight came to disaster, investigators warned that it was only a matter of time before a similar chain of events could end very differently. As a result of this incident, Singapore Airlines revised its threat and error management model. They created stricter guidelines for diverting to alternate airports when the likelihood of reaching the destination looks slim, or when controllers can't provide definitive updates on runway availability and weather. The airline began reviewing its airport briefing documents to ensure every airport was covered in the same level of detail, including whether autolands were permitted and whether localizer beams were properly aligned. They reminded pilots to make their own independent assessment using official charts, rather than relying solely on company summaries, before deciding on procedures like autoland. Singapore Airlines also created a dedicated simulator exercise for its pilots, replicating the conditions faced by the crew of Flight 319. Its purpose is to test pilots' ability to apply the airline's fuel policy, manage holds, and make timely diversion decisions in rapidly changing weather. The passengers and crew of Flight 319 were lucky, but not all flights have been this fortunate. To see what happens when fuel runs out before options do, watch the story of Aviana Flight 52. From desperation came preparation.